Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So I came across the Arab slave trade and I realized something very important, that we actually do not know anything, or we do not know much about the Arab slave trade like we do the European slave trade, because the Europeans usually tell us that they conquered us and that we should fear them and that they are superior. They tell us that story. So we don't really hear about the Arab. It's not really that documented like the other slave trades. So I thought it would be interesting for us to talk about it. So let us watch the video and learn together. So please guys, if you've not subscribed, please subscribe and comment, like, and I'll see you in my next episode. Bye.
So today I thought it would be interesting to talk about the African slave trade to Asia and the Indian Ocean islands. So unlike the transatlantic slave trade, the transportation of slaves from Africa to Asia and the Mediterranean was quite a great period of time. Obviously, there's an intense historical interest in the transatlantic slave trade that has quite foreshadowed the study of the Asian slave trade. And I think we all know that this has been largely ignored. Despite the fact that the Africans that were exported to Asia was spread out over thousands of years, between 800 AD and 1900 AD, were estimated at approximately the same number of Africans taken to the Americas, more than 13 million. So the African slave trade to Asia was across the Sahara Desert, over the Red Sea, and from the coast of East Africa. So the evidence that we are not able to provide was said to be carved in stone. In 2900 BCE, it was artwork depicting a boat on the Nile, packed with Nubian captives for enslavement in Egypt. I think we can all agree that Egyptian influence is present in Asian culture, whether it be Chinese, Indian, Taiwanese, you name it. So throughout the next 5,000 years from that time period, African slaves captured in war, raids, or even in markets were marched down the Nile across the Sahara to the Mediterranean. Others transported over the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean to Asia. So during this time period, Greeks and Romans continued the ancient Egyptian raids into Nubia and sent military expeditions from their cities along the southern Mediterranean shores, pretty much to return with slaves from the islands of the Sahara. The slaves were used in fields, households, mines, and armies of Mediterranean and Asian empires. The Roman slave community had a modest portion of African slaves, since the most abundant supply from Asia and the rest of Europe became more than adequate for economic and military needs of their empires. But African slaves were more numerous in the Roman cities of the Mediterranean littoral. Now, keep in mind, there's no actual estimate of the number of slaves exported from Africa to the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean before the arrival of Arabs in Africa. So if you've been on my page, you would know that I've been saying it's not the first time that Asia is in Africa trying to colonize. They're coming back to perfect. As we carry on, please keep in mind about the Silk Road and enlighten yourself about it. Ask yourself, why now would China be funding the Silk Road routes? Now I want us to pay attention to this picture. We see an Arabic, Asian, Indian, Masa vibe, and of course our people in the back. Now also start asking yourself questions as to why East Africa has got quite the Islam Indian influence and a large Indian and Arabic wealth compared to the natives. So let's get into the Silk Road. Slaves, like silks, were Silk Road goods, as we all know, to be bought, used, and sold for profit. These slaves were transported long distances on land and sea to trade in foreign markets. Well, no slaves from this time survived to tell their story. They have left behind art, archaeological evidence, and texts. As we can see right here, I do not know the translation, but we will carry on. So from these we can see that slavery was found throughout the Silk Road. Slaves, on the other hand, besides dying in the heat, parched, thirsty, hungry, and abandoned on the way, play no central role at all in the Silk Road route itself, besides being carried like luggage to the other side. So slave markets were found throughout the Silk Road. So besides the fact that trade was by private merchants, governments also profited by imposing taxes, both on the movement and on the sale of slaves, along with many other things that were traded along the Silk Road. So there was local and regional trade, but mainly long distance trade. So if you haven't already heard about the cities, So this is a screenshot from a video that you can find online. But he basically says, although we're thousands of miles away from Africa, her spirit has never left us. Another big brother of ours says the African soul is woven in our identity. But let's get into the story of the city. They were brought as slaves by Arab traders to India in about 628 AD. There was also a number of them brought by the Deccan Sultanates. These were Bantu from Southeast Africa. In the 16th century, another transportation of Bantu from Southeast Africa were brought to the Indian subcontinent by the Portuguese as slaves. Because of the Arab Islamic influence that they had already faced in East Africa, many of them chose to escape to Islamic regions within the area rather than becoming Catholics under Portuguese rule. So a number of them blended in with Hindus due to the surrounding native Hindu majority, under strict code that they would be guards and soldiers. This is where the rise of the East India Company begins. Now, if you're South African, you will be able to correlate this with the Dutch East India Company that was formed in South Africa by Jan van Riebeeck. So, Bantu slaves under Indian rule faced oppressive and brutal tactics. They were flogged and forced to work with little food. The only way that you could escape this kind of situation was if you became Muslim. Many slaves were stripped of their culture, their names, and everything that came with it, especially their language. They were forced to adapt to the British Indian language, religion, names, and rituals. But as we can see, a lot of the African slaves held on to their African tradition and passed it on to their children, who are now speaking out about it. Most of the African slave descendants can trace their ancestry to Mozambique and Madagascar and up the southeast coast of Africa. Because they've been outcasted by society, they are called forest dwellers, as that is the only area that they are able to live freely. It gets worse. So most of these African descendants can be confused with being African tourists, until they can speak the local languages, of course. But let's move back into Africa, where our African kin were taken. At this point, Arabs are working the slave trade in East Africa. They settled in a place called Bagamoyo. This town was the exit terminal for the slave caravans, specifically from the area around Lake Tanganyika, quite far inside the country. This was pretty much a 3-month trek. So per trek, at least 10 slaves died along the way, on every convoy. This is said to be the longest, yet least discussed of the trading of African slaves. It really began in the 7th century AD. Arabs and Asians poured into the northern and eastern parts of Africa under the banner of Islam, either converting or subjugating the African communities they came across. In the beginning, they came with a kind of mutual respect. Just to add that there was an Arab poet in the late 600 AD who wrote a poem called The Children of the Stinking Nubian. Black God put no light in their complexion. As this Islamic prosperity grew, so did the air of hostility towards the black Muslims. Arabs started to complain that they had to work next to blacks in high positions. At this point, Arabic writing becomes laced with anti-black sentiments. If you can't stomach it, I'd like you to please find a book called The Book of Glory of the Blacks Over the Whites. So this new attitude towards blacks by Arabs marked the beginning of African enslavement by the Arabs. At first, the enslavement focused on Africans that Arabs felt were inferior to them. So they began themselves to start raiding African villages in seek of humans to sell. Obviously, the great resistance of the African made it quite difficult. So they seek the aid of the fellow African Muslim or the recently converted black Africans. The African Muslims rationalized the slavery of their non-Muslim brethren as the selling of unbelievers, kafirs. Other times, Arabs would demand tribute in the form of human bodies from Africans, wary of the fight against Arabic Islamic incursions. They pretty much used the divide and conquer technique. They worked one against the other and took or killed the good or strongest. In Africa, this was called the Black Holocaust. And there's a book named exactly in that accord. So at these slave markets, the Muslim Arabs would inspect their intended purchases. Women and young girls were degradingly probed by these men in public or private stores to test their sexual worth. This was also done to children under 7. Slaves who didn't survive their time in these markets were left to rot. And because it was known that hyenas were in numerous amounts in that region, it was purposeful to allow hyenas to gorge themselves on human flesh. This slave trade turned out to be a slave trade and directed specifically towards African women and children, also known as the Eastern